Hi, welcome. On this video, I want to respond by way of a social media post put out by a very popular balanced dog trainer, goes by the name of Jonas Black. The same Jonas Black who is organizing another confused and compromised balanced dog trainer conference for 2025. And here in this post, I want to respond because again, this really illustrates the confusion that balanced dog training represents. And again, I talk about the source of the problem in the dog training world. I'm talking about this idea that training is a learning-based exercise once a relationship problem is already underway between a dog and owner. And with how trainers, including balanced dog trainers, superficially motivate dogs to respond while assuming that those responses represent that the perceptions of dogs are changing the right way. Again, I talk about why it's so common for dog owners to experience a counterfeit picture, even as dogs are going through the motions, responding in the training environment for the sit down, come and stay, only to discover once they go back home in the real world that the relationship hasn't actually gotten any better. And again, the reason for this is, again, I talk about those two core ingredients, influence and control, actually not being reconciled, not coming in, not aligning by way of this idea of things. Because again, I talk about the path that balanced dog trainers are taking by way of this idea. They're not actually approaching training as what it represents in terms of a intervention. So again, when I talk about the two core ingredients being reconciled, the only way, okay, that they're reconciled is by way of a intentional interaction based approach, which again changes the perception of dogs the right way, leads to diminishment of unwanted behavioral issues, and again the ability to be able to even work through a relationship problem between a dog and the owner. Now here again, very, very telling, okay, these posts being put out. Even again, the dog training world is a complete train wreck. You go on to social media, you see all this infighting, you see all the confusion, you see all the controversies. And again, I encourage you to check out my Flipping the Script series on my YouTube channel, where I show that all the many controversies that have happened over the last several months and years, that they're no accidents or coincidence, that they're all connected to this idea of things, the confusion over the role of influence, the inability to reconcile the reactions of dogs to the relationship, and certain controversies such as the bonker controversy involving Jeff Gellman really serve as a perfect example, okay, or bad example, depending on how you look at it, as to why it is the dog training world is a mess. And even in that situation, what you saw there is all these balanced dog trainers, piling on, trying to have Gellman canceled, just like force-free trainers. Now, in saying that, it's not a defense of Gellman or that situation. Again, I put out a video, I talked through that in terms of the confusion, but also the reaction of the dog itself that triggered off so much, so much hatred towards Gellman. Now, here I'm going to read some of this because, again, really want to talk through these, a lot of this information being put out by these confused and compromised dog trainers, such as Jonas Black. So here starts off, says, I'm not anti-force-free dog training. Well, of course he's not. Okay, and of course balanced dog trainers are not, especially considering that they're in agreement, okay, with this idea that training is a learning-based exercise, okay, based on a relationship problem. So the fact that they're not anti-force free puts them in a position of compromise. Again, if you go watch the video put out by way of Jamie Penrith going on Good Morning Britain, trying to defend the use of remote collars, you'll see how the moment builds up towards where he's directly challenged on their usage, where he's put himself or balanced dog trainers in general have put themselves in a position where they're unable to justify the role of certain devices. And it's that moment there in which the opposing side says, well, hold on here a second. Through training, okay, we show that we can get the dog to make a different choice. So this whole thing about choices, okay, about changing the focus of a dog versus, again, when I talk about, the role of influence in terms of defining its role properly once a relationship problem is underway, and therefore, as control is manifesting through a dog's state of mind, an expressed state, in terms of intercepting, okay, that expressed state, again, properly defining the role of influence, which balanced dog trainers, they don't do that. Okay, understand that. This is why they're in a catch-22 position. Now he goes on here, that would be stupid. Force Free is a phenomenal framework. It is where all my programs begin. So again, we talk about the framework, the foundation. Okay, understand it's no different how you want to look at this. It'd be like again, I talk about the parenting example. It's like a child that's already selfish and a step parent coming into, into the family unit trying to be the friend. Okay, and when a relationship problem is already underway. Okay, so it's no different here. This whole thing with trying to establish a rapport with the dog. Another video that really kind of highlights this whole established trust and rapport is the Tom Davis video I did, where Tom Davis is interacting with an aggressive dog, a Doberman, and he gets redirected on several times as he tries to introduce the tug toy, trying to establish a rapport, an outlet for the dog. And I talk about this whole thing about control, fulfillment, how it manifests. So not just a bad idea, but certainly a quick way to get bitten. Versus, again, establishing the proper framework, the proper foundation through influence and control, again, with a intentional interaction-based approach. Okay, that's the right language. That's the way, in terms of changing perception of dogs, that's the way to engage a relationship problem versus this permissive, bribery-based idea of things. So here it says, it builds trust, relationship, and communication. So again, context here. I talk about the whole thing about trust. Think about trust in terms of this bribery-based idea of things. The context of agreeableness. Okay, everything's about context. So again, you want to talk about certain concepts such as counter conditioning, how it is that things can appear a certain way and not be, in terms of agreeableness. And think of it like the selfish child example again. The themes of bribery, accommodation, and negotiation. Sure, you can gain agreeableness through certain themes, but it doesn't mean whatsoever that the relationship's getting any better. So understand the deceptive nature within the dog training world is that certain moments are being packaged up a certain way, and this is why people get blindsided. They're like, okay, why did I get bitten? Had certain moments happen that looked fantastic. That was because context. Okay, and those two core ingredients I talk about, influence and control, they're absent. Okay, they're not brought in the right way through a interaction-based method, and it leaves the door completely wide open for bad things to happen. He says, by pretending that, that is where the work ends, is where things start to fall apart. This is where people in the industry is pushing the belief that all dogs can be trained using only reinforcement, see, and this is the trap. So understand that, I talk about, balanced dog trainers trying to have their cake and eat it too. They're trying to bring, a certain level of influence into the equation by what is called the 4 quadrants. But again, understand that they put themselves in a catch-22 situation. Okay, it's a trap. Okay, because they come into agreement with this idea that does not, reconcile influence that way. Okay, so I talk about, Force Free trainers having the high ground. Well, they do. This is why balanced dog trainers are being challenged at all levels. They're losing their tools. They're constantly being challenged on social media, and for good reason. There's no dog ever needs pressure. That averses are inherently unethical. That narrative exists and is dangerous. See, and that's the problem here, is trying to turn it around, trying to say, well, however, the exception clause. And again, it doesn't fit, okay, based again on what the foundation of this idea represents. This is because when it fails, when a dog keeps lunging, when the fear does not resolve, when the resource guarding escalates, these same trainers throw the dog on medication, call it untrainable, or blame the owner. And this is the blame shifting. But understand the same thing happens with balanced dog trainers engaging in blame shifting. They encounter what I call the 1 percentile dogs. They can't work through it because this is the kind of the stopping point. This is where things bottom out. Okay, and this is again going into the Jeff Gellman situation where balanced dog trainers get triggered and they're pile on too. All the confusion because again, there's no clarity. Clarity does not come through this idea. It doesn't come through balanced dog training. Okay, it puts people in a bad position. It puts dogs in a bad position. But balanced dog trainers, again, they think somehow they're able to, justify it and get away with it. But again, they're in a bad position. This is why, again, the information I put out, there's a reason why they don't like it. Okay, even though it makes sense. I help dogs and owners all the time. But again, when I talk on social media about the problems in the dog training world, even though the dog training world is a complete train wreck, these balanced dog trainers, they do not want to look at the controversies. They don't want to admit there's a problem. They don't want to step back from it. They're all in, okay? And this is why, again, you don't hear them talking about or even wanting to address what the real issue is. So he goes on here. You can read the rest of it yourself. But here's the big takeaway here is saying, I'm not anti-force-free dog training. Okay, that's it. That's an incredible statement because here's the difference between, again, what I put out in terms of what training represents. Years ago, I was invited to sit alongside some clicker trainers to have kind of a friendly discussion, to come alongside them through, at the time in Canada, through the Humane Society. I outright refused, and I did it in a good way. I explained why, based on what training represents. But here's the problem is that, in terms of the line, I talk about trainings and interventions, it doesn't follow the path of a learning-based exercise. There's your line. But understand that balanced dog trainers, they've crossed that line, okay? Understand this is why you look at them, how they talk, they sound the same as force-free trainers. They act the same as force-free trainers. They engage in the same concepts as force-free trainers for a reason because they're married to the same idea of things. They're joined at the hip. This is why, if you ever wonder why balanced dog trainers, they're unable to call out force-free trainers like Zach George going all day long. They can't call these individuals out because how can you call out something that you're in agreement with a statement like this? Okay, I mean, it's incredible to me why people are not getting this. So I encourage you to apply critical thinking here. Again, I have lots of information on my website, on my YouTube channel. But here's the thing. I also have what I call the question of the century. Okay, posted front and center on my Facebook page, and it relates to the criteria. And not a single, so-called self-proclaimed dog training expert has been able to respond to this question for a reason. And what's the question? Well, what is the criteria that these trainers, like Jonas Black and all these other balanced trainers, are using to establish that the perception of dogs are changing the right way within the framework of response? Like, what is it? Well, there is none, okay, for them. In fact, I talk about the criteria that reveals and changes its influence and control, okay, coming through a intentional interaction-based method. That's the reveal and that's the change part. But again, understand, balanced dog trainers, they're not dialed in that way. In fact, when dogs are responding, when they're using motivating agents to get dogs to respond, they're assuming that the perceptions of the dogs are changing. It's assumption-based. It's totally inherently flawed. And so if you ever wonder, well, how does the dogs can look fantastic responding in the training environment, but still holding a level of control in the relationship, still bad things happening? Well, that's it in a nutshell. So again, I encourage you to check out the information I put out. It's very specific. But again, trainers are putting out these narratives for a reason because they're compromised. Balanced dog trainers have been playing the same game since the beginning, just like force-free trainers. But they're definitely compromised, and they're in a catch-22 situation. Thanks for watching.